My name is John Ross, and welcome to the Art of Retouching Studio. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about all the different retouching steps that I did to create this image for an article that I wrote for fstoppers.com, as well as a beginner's tutorial on smart objects and smart filters. As you can imagine, this particular behind the scenes will be heavy on smart objects and smart filters, as well as high pass sharpening, dodge and burn, as well as adjustment layers, and all of that is built on top of the original raw file, which can still be accessed from within Adobe Camera Raw. So if you want to see what a truly non-destructive workflow is, it's not going to get any better than this. At least until Adobe fixes a core problem with masking smart filters, but we'll talk about that a little later. So let's get started. And here's the original image as it came out of the camera. The camera was a Nikon D800, which is a 36 megapixel camera, and it is amazing. And there's even an upgrade to that camera as well, and I just can't believe it, because once you see the quality in this, there's no going back to a standard camera. I mean, 16 megapixels and 18 megapixels are just horrible in comparison to what you can get. That high crisp quality, every hair is just crystal clear. It's amazing. And from a retouching standpoint, that's the worst thing in the world. I tell you, because now I have to take care of every little pore, every little hair, and you can go crazy worrying about all this stuff because that camera really pulls out every little bit of detail. And there are other high-end cameras just like that one. So do I love working on those images? Absolutely. Do I hate working on those images? Absolutely. But let's not think about that right now. Let's just focus at the task at hand, which is to bring this image to a baseline. So there are only a couple settings in this basic panel that I actually adjust, and this is what they are. We can make this exposure a 0.65, highlight of 14, shadows of 100, clarity of 5, and saturation of 8. So now what do all these values mean? Well, basically all I did was brighten up the image, brighten up all of the shadow detail, add clarity, and add some saturation. But the image looks flat, and that comes from the shadows. And I want to point this out to you specifically, because I have no problem taking these shadows and opening them all the way up. The real trick of it is to take these blacks and bring them all the way down. If you ever watch any of my videos where I do camera raw work, you will often see me take these shadows and really push them up, usually somewhere around here, and then push the blacks back down. Because generally what happens is you're opening up the shadow detail for more detail to be seen, and then you're putting that punch back in with the blacks. So it adds that contrast. So something along these lines is generally how I work on my images. Now in this particular image, I don't go into any of the other panels or use any of the other tools. This is a very straightforward retouch for me. However, instead of clicking on Open Image, we're going to hold down the Shift key, and the Shift key is going to change it to Open Object. The basic difference here is instead of opening the image, it will open up an object. The difference here is that the image is background layer, pixels, we can't edit ever again. However, if we click on Open Object using the Shift key, now it's going to open up like a smart object. And when we click it, what's going to happen is it's going to open up this image inside of Camera Raw. And the huge benefit here is that we're going to have the ability to actually go back into the raw file if and whenever we need to. For example, as you know, if it says background and it's pixel based, well, it is what it is. There's nothing more we can do to it. If we want to make color and tonal changes, we have to build on top of it as an adjustment layer. However, because this is a smart object, I can double click on it and go back into the original smart object, which contains the raw file. So for example, I can take this exposure, crank it all the way up, and click OK. So Camera Raw is going to reprocess the file, Photoshop's going to reinterpret the file, and then when it finishes, it's going to give us this blown out image. Now, in case we don't want to do it, we just hit undo, and that change goes away. But I just wanted to show you that we had the ability to do that, and that is the power of a smart object. No matter how far along we go, we always have the ability to go backward. Now, I'm not going to be talking about smart objects specifically in this video because I have a lot of different topics that I want to talk about. If you do want to learn more about smart objects and actually understand how they work, as I mentioned, I do have an article and video on fstoppers.com. as well as my own website, www.theartofretouching.com, and you can find the entire class on the right-hand side. It's a nice big button, and it is labeled Portraits, Camera Raw, and Smart Objects, where I talk about all three in great detail. Now in this case, I just want to keep moving on this video, so now I want to add some filters to this. And the beauty of using filters on top of Smart Objects is that they are completely editable. Just like the raw file is inside of the Smart Object, any filters that we use on top of the Smart Object are also completely editable. Let me show you. I'm going to click on Filter, come down to Imagenomic, and go Portraiture. Oh, I know, blasphemy, right? Well, depending on your background, you may either use Portraiture or you may not. Now, if you want to spend the 2, 3, 4 hours doing all of that little blemish work by hand, then be my guest. I, however, have other things to do with my time, and I would rather spend 30 seconds on this topic rather than the next 3 hours. Is it a shortcut? Yes. Is anybody paying me to do it the long way? Absolutely not. Again, it all depends on your industry and what your goals are, but for me, there's nobody paying me to sit here and do 3 hours worth of work, so I'm going to avoid that at all costs. So for me, this is the path of least resistance. However, like any other tool, there is a right way and a wrong way. I'm going to show you the right way. Portraiture is best used very, very subtly. You don't want to just use all these sliders and buttons and things just because they're available. Don't do it. Here is the very simple way that you should be using Imagenomic Portraiture. Take this top setting of fine, bring it down to the left, which is -20. Take medium, leave it in the middle to a setting of 0. Take large, bring it over to a setting of +20, and then it simply adjust the threshold for more or less of that effect. All this other stuff is a little bit of cannon fodder, simply meaning it's extra, don't worry about it. I do have a video on my website, once again, www.theartofretouching.com, where you can find an actual walkthrough video on how to properly use Imagenomic Portraiture, where I do talk about all these different settings and what they can actually be used for. But for our purposes today, we don't need any of that. Simply, I'm going to take threshold and bring this up to 20, and I'm going to show you what happens. I'm going to zoom in here. And inside of her skin, if I hold the button down, this is the original. This is what was actually here. When I let go, that's what Imagenomic Portraiture did. If I move over here, notice it's affecting up here and down here, but it's not doing much to the eyes. It's a little bit in here, but it's nothing really horrible. However, a value of 20 is high. Normally, I would not use a value of 20 because it really does make the skin look pasted over. Even though up close you have a lot of detail, when you do back off, you'll see that it does a little bit too much. So I'm going to bring this value by half, and I can make it a value of 10. If I like this, then great, that's what I'm going to use. If I think that I need less, I'll go down to 5. If I need more, I'll bring it up. But for this particular image, I made the value of 10. Now it does go all the way up, but I actually use very, very little. More often than not, I use it as 5. Simply, it's a way of turning a lot of extra work to a little extra work. That's all it is. And notice when I look over here at the eye, at that value, nothing is really changing in here. If anything, it's very little, which I end up pulling back later anyway during the sharpening process. But what I'm looking to get rid of is all this discoloration. Now, I have heard of others that do this on a low pass in order to get rid of all this excess detail, which is fine too. You know, any way you want to use it, as long as it works for you. There is no right way or wrong way. I'm just showing you how I went and approached it. So now at this point, what I've done is I've added portraiture, so I've softened back the skin. However, I do want to bring out a little bit more detail inside of the eyes and the hair and other areas. So in order to do that, I'm going to use Unsharp Mask. And I'm going to make this amount 50 and the radius of 5. Why? I don't know. It looked good to me. I'm going to click OK and wait for that to process. And now we've softened the skin and we've added a bunch more detail back in. And the net result is this. This is the before and this is after. Before, after. But now I'm not actually going to leave it like this completely. This right here is a mask. It acts like a layer mask. Simply white reveals everything, which is all of this effect. So if white reveals, black conceals. So I'm going to take a brush on black, click on that layer, and I'm going to start painting in. And basically what I want to paint in is along the hairline, because simply all that sharpening and stuff, I don't want it to affect all the hair. It can do other things in other areas, but I just don't want it right there. The other areas that I want to limit this sharpening on is actually up here in the skin areas, because it actually looks better without it. So I don't want to enhance that. So once again, I'll just take a smaller brush and I'll run across these fingers like this so that that sharpening doesn't actually happen. Something like this, you get the idea. For real, I would be a lot more concerned in matching detail. However, for this simple video, I'm not going to worry about that. Then, since I do want to soften other areas, like down here, I want a softer effect, because if you zoom in, you can see all these blemishes that go on down here. So what I actually need to do is run another pass through portraiture. But the real limitation with smart objects and smart filters as of this recording, and I am screaming as loud as I can to get Adobe to fix this, but we have a single smart filter mask. That's it. So if I have portraiture and sharpen, which are two completely different effects, I only have one mask, and that is a huge limitation. Now, I don't understand why I can't have a mask for the unsharp mask, so I can not sharpen hair in certain areas, and then have portraiture skin just for the skin. The way that it works is limiting, and it causes me excessive work. But for this particular video and how I had to handle this particular image, all I could really do is make a duplicate of this layer right here, and take these smart filters and throw them away. So now here we have the same exact raw file, which is inside of both of these. Like if I double clicked and I go inside of them as a smart object, it will be the identical raw file inside. The only difference here is I'm going to do a completely different effect on this layer on top. And this is simply to compensate for this whole masking problem. Otherwise, I wouldn't even need to bother. So I'll go filter, and once again, go into Imagenomic Portraiture. And this time, instead of doing it at a low value of 10, I'm going to bring it up all the way to 40. And if I was to use this on the skin, it would be way too much. However, I'm going to use it down here in the lower parts of this image where I don't want to see all this detail. And I'm not going to use it all over so it looks all pasty like this. I will be creating a mask in order to go around certain areas that look the worst. So now I'll click on this Smart Filter Mask, turn this entire thing to black so that it conceals the entire effect, which I use Alt Backspace on my keyboard because I'm on a PC right now. And then simply with a white brush go in here and just start painting back in these center pieces that are generally distorted. Things that I want less detail on, because down here at the bottom of the image, people are less prone to be seeing all this. Now right now I'm going in here with an opacity of 100%. However, during the real working on the image, I used a Wacom tablet with an opacity, pressure sensitivity, flow, and whatever else I actually did. And then now here is going to be the final mask I came up with. So as you can see, there are certain areas that I was heavier with and other areas I was not as heavy with. And the basic end result was something along the lines of this. So simply, I softened it back, but I wasn't trying to be heavy-handed about it. Just enough so that it wasn't obvious. So right now, this background is basically taken care of, and this is what I personally would consider a good base image. I've taken care of tonal problems, some general color problems in the raw processor. Then I did the skin corrections, did a little sharpening, and together these two can go into a folder. I'll name it back for background, and then now this will act as what I would consider an out of the camera image that I can start building on top of inside of Photoshop with different adjustments and other changes that I need to make. Now somewhere that I want to start is going to be with high pass sharpening. Now I know previously I did unsharp mask, but generally that was to enhance the details in the skin. What I'm going to do now is to enhance the details of the eyes and the eyelashes and other little areas like that that I want to create a little bit more punch with. So it's a different type of sharpening used on different areas. So let me show you how I go about doing this, once again using Smart Objects. So I'm going to take this background again, and I'm going to make another duplicate copy of it. I'm going to throw away this Smart Filter as it exists, take it outside of this background folder. So now I just have another copy of this, which once again goes back to the exact same raw file, which means that if I do an alteration to any of these raw files within any of these 3 layers, it's going to propagate to each of those 3 layers. So if I make a change to one, it's going to happen to all 3. Additionally, if you're concerned about file size, this is the same file, simply referenced 3 times. It's not making 3 copies within this single image. Sometimes you might need to, but in this case I do not. So now at this point I'm going to take this and I'm going to go Filter, Other, High Pass. Now you can adjust these settings as you need depending on the type of high pass that you want. You can make it a radius of 10, make it a radius of 5, of 4, whatever you deem normal best practices are for your own smart objects. For me, I'm going to raise this value up high to a value of 10. Now I know it's high, but I work my images with more control, so I often have more flexibility on the back end. And because of that, I'd rather go high here on the front end. Then change the blend mode to overlay so that effectively we've extra sharpened this image, because here's the before and here's the after. But now I'm going to throw a mask over the top of this, fill this mask with a black so that no effect is actually happening at this point because black conceals. Now I can take my paintbrush of white and then using a variety of opacity, flow, as well as pressure sensitivity, again, as needed, depends on how you like to work, I'm now able to come back in here and start painting on certain areas with more control, and certainly more control than you just see me doing right now, but to basically come in here and just hit upon certain areas that I want to have a little bit more punch. So now when I take the time to actually do the mask, this is what the mask looks like. And you can see certain areas are darker than others, and I take a little bit more time to brush in different details so that when I'm done, this is what the enhancements are. Okay, before and after, before and after. So it just gives the image a little bit more punch within the sharpness of certain areas that I want to grab your attention. Once again, because I went heavy with this high pass, I'm able to pull down the opacity of the layer. In this case, I went down to 70% and more opacity when I painted it on. So even though I went heavy on the front end with 10, it's very easy for me to pull back on it later as I'm working. It's easier to take away than it is to put in afterwards. So when it comes to removing blemishes like this, all these little dots that are on her skin all over her face, there's many different ways to actually approach this. So I'm just going to show you a couple different ways that this could be approached, and one of which is with dodge and burn. So if I hold down my Alt key when I click on the new layer, it gives me this dialog box. Change the mode to overlay, and then click on this fill with overlay neutral color, 50% gray, and go OK. So now at this point, we have a 50% gray set to overlay, so effectively nothing has happened. But what we are now allowed to do is use our brush with black and white and different opacities and flows in order to touch up the skin. So I'm going to give a big one just as a quick example with an opacity of 100%. When I paint in with black, that is going to darken the skin. If I flip this around to white and I paint on the skin, now it's going to bring it down to white. So effectively, undo, undo, if I take each and every one of these pores as a problem, if I were to lighten some areas and darken other areas, you can even out the skin tones. So I'm going to drop this down to 20, which is still a little heavy-handed, but I just want to get through this quickly. So on white, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lighten these darker areas So I'm going to bring this opacity down to 10%, which is actually a little bit heavy-handed, but I just want to get through this. So with white, 10%, I'm just going to paint the darker areas, and that effectively makes them a little bit lighter. Then I can take the black, flip this around, and paint on the lighter area. Now, I'll say this. If you use an opacity of 10%, you can go over it once and it's only going to do 10%. If you were to change flow to 10% as opposed to opacity, each time you pass over an area, it's going to add 10% to it. So simply flow is every pass is going to give you the tone 10% more. Or if you do opacity, it's only going to do 10% until you let go and then click again, and then it'll give you another 10%. It's simply a different way of working, and it depends on what your end goal is. So ultimately, I would be doing this with a Wacom tablet, and it will take a very, very long time. Yes, literally, you would come in here with white and lighten this, effectively dodging, and then you would flip it around to black, and you would go over it again and effectively burn the area. So you're burning the lights and you're dodging the darks, and you're going to be here all day long. But when you finish actually doing this, you start to even out all these skin tones, and it's not nearly as bad as it once was. Now here's the before and there's the after. Before and after. Now even I have my limits. I can't be sitting here all day working on this. So to see what this layer actually looks like, here's the dodge and burn layer with the 50% gray, and everything is lightening and darkening as it goes through the entire image. As you can imagine, this is very tedious. It takes hours on end, and I have other things to do with my life. But now there is a difference in the high-end retouching where you have a client that will pay for that type of work. Absolutely, that's fine. I'm all for it. However, my clients are not going to pay me that type of money in order to spend that type of time. So I have to come up with faster ways to do a similar type of work. And for me, the way that I need to do that is make a new blank layer, double click on it, and go spotting. Do you know what spotting is? Spotting refers to removing spots within an image, and it otherwise means I'm cloning. So what kind of cloning? Well, the same kind of cloning that you are doing with the dodge and burn, except you don't have to be nearly as detailed with it because the healing brush does an amazing job at fixing many of the problems. It's simply faster to do it. Using the healing brush tool, aligned is unchecked, and simply pick yourself a relatively small brush and just dab it. Dab it, dab it. Click, click, click. Because it matches color and tone, or tone and color, and does whatever it wants, and usually does a very good job of it, you don't have to keep resetting your point. But if you want to, you could reset your point holding down the Alt key, click again, and then proceed. This is not a tutorial on how to use the healing brush, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But simply, after I finish working on this image like this, we would actually end up with a layer that looks like this. As you can see, I went in here and did a lot of little detail work, and ultimately, to me, that's way faster than using the dodge and burn method, as well as even the frequency separation. However, there's nothing wrong with any technique, and I will use all of them or any of them. However, in this particular image, this is the way that I went, simply because it was quicker and easier. Between takes, I did resize the image using the crop tool, so it is cropped in a little bit more than the last time you just saw it. So now, because we're working more in details, let's look at the eyelashes. Basically, they lack any real visual interest, and there are a variety of different ways to go about adding in more eyelashes. However, this was once again my way of approaching the situation. I simply took a new curve layer that looks like this. So simply, I darkened the image. And then on top of the mask, I used an eyelash brush, which I have down here inside of my brushes. It would just look something like this. See that? And you just dab it in, and then it looks like that. And I applied that to the layer mask, so it looks like this. Again, this is just a quick way of approaching the problem. And it simply darkened up her eyes, giving it a little bit more visual interest. Now when it comes to dodging and burning, there are two basic different ways of doing it. There's the gray layer, like I showed you here, and this works best on small little details, like you just saw with the pores. However, there's another way of doing it using curves, and that works better as an overall change when you're taking big sweeping changes to the skin, under the chin or on the forehead and things along those lines. And again, to each their own, everyone has their own method, but here's how I actually approach it. I'll create 2 new curve layers, and I'll put both of those inside of a subfolder called D&B for dodge and burn. And then inside of here, we'll name one darker and name one lighter. And then the darker one, we're going to change this to be darker. Simply grab the curve and bring it down. Now the lighter one, I'm going to grab the curve and make it lighter. To compensate for this color shift, on each of these layers, we're going to change it from normal to luminosity. Normal and luminosity. This way it makes tonal changes instead of color changes as well. Lastly, we're going to fill these with black so that this effect doesn't actually happen. Now effectively we're back to where we were. When I hide that, you see no difference. But now we can go on to the darker layer and paint using white that looks like this. And then we can go on the lighter layer and paint and it'll look like this. So we're working between the darks and the lights, and we're balancing out the tones within the image, basically drawing your attention in the face where we want it to. We're 3D modeling the face. We are light sculpting. We are making it up in a way that looks very pleasing to the eye. And once again, when I'm finished doing the work, it looks like this. This is the darkening, and this is the lightening. And when they come together, it'll do this. I'm simply just balancing out the image a little bit. And when you're turning it on and off like this, even I can start seeing shifts and things that I would want to adjust. But I try not to let all this micromanaging stuff really get into my head. It's a killer. Just keep moving. If something's obvious, fix it. But otherwise, keep moving on the image. Don't zoom all in here and be worried about every little detail when there's so much more to this image that needs your attention. So zoom in, back out, keep moving. Now, since we're working on the eyelashes, I want to continue working on the eyes. I want to give these eyes punch. So what we can do is use an eye brush on a quick mask. So I'm going to click on quick mask. So now basically everything that I paint with is going to turn into a mask or selection, which is ultimately going to be part of an adjustment layer. And so in order to create a very nice looking iris, now I can obviously come in here and just paint like this and paint like this, clean it up and do it that way, but often I have a better way of working. I will go with down here, I have iris brushes, and these can also, like the eyelash brushes, be downloaded off the internet. Just do a Google search and then you can load it in right here with load brushes. So you download it, you load it, and then it drops in all kinds of nice new neat brushes for you. So I'm just going to pick one that's dead center here, make it smaller, and basically inside of the eyes I'm going to do this. And it's going to create an iris effect. When I zoom in, you can see that there's all this little detail that's going on. So it just enhances the eyes when there's a low level of detail going on. So basically I kind of match it, line it up, click, come over here, line it up, click. Then when I come out of the quick mask, I now have the iris selected so I can apply something to it. In this case, I'm going to affect the vibrance and saturation of the eye. And in doing so, I'm just going to take this and crank it all the way up. Now, I could pull it back and go at different settings, so I can do a little bit on vibrance, a little bit on saturation. I can play with it, tweak it, whatever I want to do. But this is 2 sliders. I'd rather just work on the one and make it 50%. Because it's not only the setting here, but by changing this, it's also the setting of the mask itself. Basically, I'm taking the entire layer of vibrance, saturation, and the mask and dropping it down 50%. Is it heavy-handed? Yeah, maybe. But you know what? I'm trying for some colorful punch to the image. If it catches your eye, then it catches your eye. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Besides, you can always adjust this any way that you want within your own images. So in the interest of moving this video along, because it's becoming as long as I expected, but way longer than I had hoped, I'm just going to quickly show you some changes that were made to the original file. Here's one where I alter the background color a little bit using a curve. And then here is photo filter, which basically I used it like a desaturator. And I only did it on certain areas, which are these right here. And then up here we have a curve, which simply adds a little bit of deeper contrast. Okay, so that was a few various changes to the image. One of the problems I was fighting the whole time was this shine on top of her head. You know, many people leave it in. For me, for my own style, I like to take it out. I don't like that type of punch right on the forehead. So this is simply a curve, bringing it down a little bit with a mask that looks like this. And this is simply a before and after. Before and after. So it brings the shine here as opposed to up here. And mainly those are areas that are out of bounds anyway. You know, you don't want to bring the eye here. I want the eye down here. Now, generally speaking, one last thing that I want to be working on is going to be this backdrop. And I'm not a fan of this gray backdrop. While I am a fan of this bluish color because cools go back and warms come forward, and that simply enhances this, the net result of it is when I'm done, it's not going to look like this anyway. I simply want a little bit more texture and a little bit more interest inside of the image. So for that, we go to Google. And for Google, I'm just going to go, and inside of Google, just type in texture, images for texture, and then if you click search tools, you can sort by size, and then you can find the image that has a larger megapixel, find a texture that you like, and then when you do find something that you like, whatever it is, give it a chance to finish drawing with this line down here. It's downloading the image. Give it a chance. When it finishes, you will now have access to whatever the high resolution file is. Right click and then go copy image. So now in this case, I've already downloaded an image, whatever it was. After I drop it in here like this, while your normal reaction might be to then scale it using Edit Free Transform, however, what I would offer is this. Instead, right click on the layer and go Convert to Smart Object. If you do that, then this will give you the opportunity to scale the image up and down, and it doesn't matter how many times that you do scale it up and down, it will always reference back to the original file. So what that ultimately means is you can make it big, take a look at it. If you don't like it, you can rotate it. It'll reference the original file, pull that back in. You may scale it a little bit. It'll always reference the original file, and it will always retain its high quality settings. So right now, if I go to Free Transform and blow it up and say OK, it's going to go back to the original, scale it up, and bring it in like this. I will also offer this one little tidbit for those that are still actually watching. Inside of Photoshop, you have Free Transform. When you do a Free Transform, just like this, or Transform, or any of these tools over here, basically it's using an old school method. It's using an old way of scaling these images. And during my testing, it is not particularly good. Inside of CC, at some point in CC, they changed something. And what they changed was this. What this means is if I use Free Transform to scale, it's using an older technology, so the scaling is not as crisp, clear, or accurate as this next way I'm going to show you, which is to create a new image, paste the texture or whatever other layer that you're actually working on, then go into Image Resize. And if you scale it up here, you have the option to use Preserve Details Enlargement. Automatic is fine because it will use this, but basically Preserve Details Enlargement is a new to CC feature and not in CS6 or 5 or 4. Now in this case, I don't care because I'm going to do something else with it, but I just thought I'd give that little bit of information to those people that are actually still watching. So now instead of leaving this up at 100%, I'm going to drop this opacity down to something low like 12%. Simply, I want a little bit of texture in the background. I'm not looking for anything heavy-handed or obvious. Just a little something so it isn't flat. I'm going to put it inside of a group folder. And the reason I'm putting it in group folders is because I'm going to add some more layers to this. For example, I know I'm going to add curves. And simply, instead of dealing with a mask on this layer of her hair and her shoulders, another mask on the curves layer of her hair and her shoulders, and yet another mask on another layer that I'm going to create, basically, instead of having 3 separate masks, because I put them all inside of a group folder and then put a mask on the group folder itself, this is going to take precedence over everything else inside of it. So I can take this layer mask on curves and simply delete it. It doesn't matter, because this mask that I paint on once is going to affect both the curve as well as the texture. Just to show you, I'm going to click on the curve and do something crazy with it. Then when I paint on this group folder mask with a black brush, you see I'm cutting through not only the curve, which is lightening the image, but also the texture. And it's going to affect any of the layers that I put inside of this folder, which contains the master mask. So when I finish doing what I'm doing, I have a mask that looks like this. Okay, some of it is a little bit detailed, some of it is ghosted back, but at the end, my intention here is so that when I put this layer of texture over it, it just kind of blends in with the hair. A little bit in, a little bit out, nobody's the wiser. I have this curve that I add to darken the background, which really brings her forward, right? And then, so it isn't quite so blue, I have a black and white layer that I simply use to neutralize the background. And I throw a little tint on it so it isn't completely neutralized. And then in this case, I've given up the cool goes backward, warm comes forward. Instead, I went with dark goes backwards, light comes forwards. So when I finish working on the image, this is the end result. I would like to thank you for sticking through this with me, and I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I also hope that you learned a couple new things along the way. While I didn't have the opportunity in this video to deal with frequency separation, I will make sure to take care of that in a future video. My name is John Ross for the Art of Retouching Studio, and I would like to thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Behind the Retouching. If you would like to learn more about Adobe Photoshop from basic to advanced videos, please go to www.theartofretouching.com, where you can find more tips and tricks to make you a better photo retoucher.